Right now, 25 of British Columbia's 29 regional districts are underwater. This is not a slow-moving seasonal shift. It is a geophysical collapse occurring in real time. For 18 straight days, the death toll has climbed without respite, defying every emergency protocol in the Canadian playbook. Since March 26, 2026, a relentless sequence of atmospheric rivers, conveyor belts of tropical moisture, has hammered the Pacific Northwest, turning the rugged coast mountains into a fluid, lethal landscape. At least 179 people are confirmed dead. Over 9,000 homes across the Fraser Valley, the Nicola Valley, and the interior plateau have been reduced to splinters or swallowed by rising silt. The structural arteries of the nation, 370 kilometers of provincial highways, and the critical Trans-Canada corridor have been ripped apart. The single most vital route connecting the Port of Vancouver to the rest of Canada is completely shut down. 18,000 acres of prime agricultural land in the Sumas Prairie and the Okanagan have been swallowed by a slurry of mud and glacial till. Downstream, the Fraser River is surging toward a catastrophic flood stage, putting Delta and Richmond on high alert for a total dike failure. But on April 5th, while the entire province was already saturated and reeling, the Earth provided a violent punctuation mark. A magnitude 5.8 earthquake struck the outskirts of Abbotsford, collapsing structures that the rain had already hollowed out from the inside. The detail that tells the real story emerged on April 7th. 22 people died in a single 24-hour period. 13 of them were not caught in the flash floods. They were not swept away by the raging Chilliwack River. They were asleep. Their own roofs, heavy with weeks of relentless rain and sodden insulation, gave way as the earthquake's lateral forces sheared their water-weakened foundations. These were homes that survived the great floods of 1948 and 1972, structures that stood through decades of Pacific storms. The thing that finally brought them down was the simple, crushing weight of water. And tonight, as more rain falls across the coast mountains, millions of Canadians are lying under roofs made of the same vulnerable materials, in a region where supply chains are already paralyzed. The forecast calls for more. This is no longer a weather event. It is a tectonic and hydrologic siege. The chronology of this collapse is a study in compounding geophysical stressors. It began at 4 a.m. Pacific Standard Time on March 26, 2026, when Environment and Climate Change Canada, ECCC, weather stations in the coast mountains began recording precipitation rates that exceeded even the 2021 atmospheric river benchmarks. In the first 72 hours, 180 millimeters of rain fell on a snowpack that was already 140% of its seasonal average. Within 3 days, 17 people were dead, swept away as the Nicola and Coldwater rivers overtopped their banks. By March 30th, the storm system had migrated eastward, crossing the continental divide into the Alberta foothills, claiming 45 lives between the two provinces in a single, massive hydrologic event. By April 4th, the death toll inside British Columbia alone surged to 77. The Geological Survey of Canada, GSC, noted that ground saturation had reached a critical threshold. Sensors in the Fraser Canyon recorded poor water pressure levels that effectively turned solid hillsides into heavy, viscous fluids. Then, the physics of the disaster shifted from fluid dynamics to plate tectonics. At 6:12 a.m. on April 5th, a magnitude 5.8 earthquake struck the edge of the Intermontane Belt, with an epicenter located just 15 kilometers northeast of Hope. Natural Resources Canada confirmed the focus was shallow, only 10 kilometers deep, sending violent high-frequency waves through the waterlogged valleys. The shaking reached Vancouver and as far east as Kelowna. In the Fraser Valley, the impact was surgical and devastating. 3 primary residential complexes in the eastern Fraser district collapsed immediately. In a single settlement near the Coquihalla corridor, 8 people perished when a localized debris flow triggered by the seismic jolt, hit with the force of a freight train. By April 6, the combined toll from floods, seismic landslides, and lightning strikes reached 110. By April 12, it hit 179. The data continues to trend upward. If we zoom out, the geographic vulnerability of Western Canada becomes terrifyingly clear. British Columbia is a labyrinth of high relief terrain, ringed by the coast mountains and the Rockies, with narrow valleys acting as high pressure funnels for both water and traffic. The eastern corridors of the province, the Kootenays and the Selkirk Range, form a restricted mountain throat that leads toward the critical mountain passes. This corridor carries the Trans-Canada Highway 1, the single most critical artery in the nation. It connects the port of Vancouver to the rest of Canada and international trade routes. That highway has been severed for over a week. The secondary route through the Fraser Canyon is also impassable. A reinforced bridge at Jackass Mountain is currently under inspection by Ministry of Transportation engineers for severe scour damage to its footings. Eastern British Columbia is effectively an island. The water destroying these roads is a transboundary threat. It is surging through the Columbia and Fraser systems, pushing levels to near bank full at points 300 kilometers downstream, threatening the low-lying dikes of Delta and Richmond. But the underlying cause is not just the rain. This disaster was engineered by decades of landscape modification. British Columbia has lost vast stretches of its old-growth forest cover to wildfires, pest infestations, and logging. In the North Thompson district, flooding was historically moderated by dense canopy. Trees intercepted rainfall, and root systems anchored the glacial till. That forest is gone. Strip a Canadian mountainside of its trees, and the physics of the watershed changes. Rain hits bare rock and thin soil. Instead of soaking in over hours, it channels into mountain streams within minutes. These streams become walls of mud that carry boulders and uprooted timber straight into the paths of towns like Merritt and Princeton. The spring melt is now colliding with this record rainfall. Natural Resources Canada's GNSS network shows vertical ground displacement of up to 5 centimeters in the Fraser Valley, not from tectonic shifting alone, but from the sheer weight of the standing water depressing the crust. We are seeing a coupled system failure. The spring monsoon is hitting an abnormally heavy snowpack, while warmer than average Pacific air accelerates the melt. You have two massive water sources, atmospheric rain from above and cryospheric melt from below, converging into the same river basins simultaneously. Tributaries that usually peak weeks apart are peaking together. And when the magnitude 5.8 quake struck on April 5th, it did more than collapse buildings. It destabilized thousands of hectares of waterlogged slopes across the interior. Soil that was already saturated and heavy received a lateral jolt that reduced its internal friction to nearly zero. In the language of the Geological Survey of Canada, the landslide risk in saturated terrain after a seismic event does not merely add, it multiplies exponentially, and the rain has not stopped. To understand the sheer scale of the 2026 catastrophe, we must look to the ghosts of Canada's geological past. This is not the first time the West has been humbled by water, but it is the first time the systems have coupled with such surgical precision. In 1948, the Fraser River breached its banks in a legendary flood that displaced 16,000 people and destroyed 2,300 homes. That was a freshet event, a rapid snowmelt. In November 2021, the province was paralyzed by an atmospheric river that severed every highway to the coast, a pluvial event. What we are witnessing now is the Great Convergence. The data models from Environment and Climate Change Canada, ECCC, suggest that the current saturation levels have exceeded the 1 in 500 year probability threshold. The numbers are staggering. 1,338 homes completely destroyed, 7,672 more significantly damaged, a total of over 9,000 structures. This is no longer an emergency. It is a national economic erasure. The physics of this disaster lies in the poor water pressure within the quaternary sediments of the Fraser Valley and the interior plateau. Under normal conditions, the weight of the soil is supported by the contact between grains. But as the rain continued for 18 straight days, the spaces between those grains filled with water. The equation for effective stress, sigma prime equals sigma minus u, where u is the pore water pressure, tells the story. As u rises, the strength of the hillside, sigma prime, drops to near zero. When the magnitude 5.8 earthquake struck near Abbotsford on April 5th, it provided a cyclic loading that caused these saturated soils to undergo instantaneous liquefaction. The ground did not just shake, it turned into a heavy liquid. This explains why the 13 people who died in their sleep on April 7th never had a chance. Their homes were not crushed by falling debris in the traditional sense. They were pulled into the earth as the very ground beneath their foundations lost its structural integrity. The economic impact is currently estimated by Public Safety Canada to exceed 18 billion Canadian dollars, eclipsing the 2016 Fort McMurray fires and the 2021 floods combined. Over 543 livestock have perished, and 15,627 hectares of prime agricultural land in the Fraser Valley, the breadbasket of British Columbia, are buried under 3 feet of toxic silt. This is the only planting window for 2026. For the farmers in the Sumas Prairie, the 2026 season is not just delayed, it is extinct. The loss of 18,000 acres of crops means the food supply chain for the lower mainland will be reliant on emergency imports for the next 18 months, at a time when the transport corridors are non-existent. Geological Survey of Canada, GSC seismologists, are now focused on a terrifying shadow effect. The April 5th quake occurred on a shallow crustal fault, distinct from the deep Cascadia subduction zone. However, the lateral jolt has redistributed stress across the Amineca belt. Historically, Canadian disasters are often viewed as isolated incidents, a flood here, a fire there, but the 2026 sequence proves that our infrastructure is designed for stationary risks, not the non-stationary reality of a changing climate. The Trans-Canada Highway was rebuilt after 2021 with armor rock and oversized culverts, yet even those were ripped apart like wet cardboard when the debris flows reached velocities of 10 meters per second. The forecast models provide no comfort. ECCC's Global Environmental Multiscale GEM model shows a secondary omega block forming over the Pacific, which will funnel another atmospheric river train directly into the coast mountains by the end of the week. This is a feedback loop. The saturated ground can no longer absorb a single millimeter of moisture. Every drop that falls now becomes instant runoff. The Fraser River at Hope is currently flowing at 14,000 cubic meters per second, approaching the record levels of 1894. Downstream, the squeeze play is on. As the Fraser pushes toward the Salish Sea, it meets an incoming king tide. The water has nowhere to go but up and over the dikes. In Delta and Richmond, the interdike areas are already weeping, as high-pressure water tunnels through the soil in a process called piping. If a main dike breaches, the resulting flood won't just be a slow rise. It will be a wall of water hitting a suburban population that has nowhere to evacuate because the highways are gone. The clock is not just ticking, it is accelerating. The human cost of this geophysical siege is best understood through the silence of the April 7th casualties. Elias Chen, a 44-year-old structural engineer living on the outskirts of Abbotsford, survived the 2021 floods by the narrowest of margins. He had spent years reinforcing his family home, believing that steel and concrete could withstand the changing climate. But on the night of April 7, 2026, the variables changed. The rain had been a constant heavy percussion for 18 days, saturating the insulation and the heavy timber framing of his roof. Then came the earthquake's aftershocks. It wasn't the shaking that did it, says Marc-André Lefebvre, a North Shore rescue veteran who led the recovery effort. The house didn't fall over. The roof simply gained so much mass from the water that the earthquake's lateral snap sheared the support pins. The roof came down as a single 5-ton slab while they were in bed. It happened in seconds. This is the reality for thousands across the Fraser Valley and the interior. In the town of Merritt, which has been evacuated 3 times in the last 5 years, the fatigue is palpable. Sarah Watley, a local rancher, described the sound of the Nicola River as a jet engine that never turns off. She is one of the 17 million Canadians now facing the downstream effects of food price surges, as the Pacific Gateway remains severed. Across the eastern provinces, the shock waves are economic. In British Columbia, they are existential. In Princeton, more than 100 families have been relocated to emergency shelters in the local hockey arena, with no timeline for return. The town is effectively an island, accessible only by heavy-lift helicopters, as the surrounding mountainsides continue to shed their skin in massive periodic landslides. The logistical nightmare is staggering. The Port of Vancouver, Canada's largest maritime hub, is currently a parking lot for billions of dollars in stranded cargo. With the Trans-Canada Highway 1, the Coquihalla Highway 5, and the Crow's Nest Highway 3, all severed by washouts and seismic fractures, the just-in-time delivery system of a G7 nation has collapsed. Public Safety Canada estimates the daily economic hemorrhage at $250 million Canadian dollars. The 370 kilometers of destroyed road are not just asphalt. They are the lifelines for medical supplies, fuel, and clean water. In the remote community of Lytton, still recovering from the fires of 2021, the cell towers went dark on April 6. Residents are using satellite phones to report that the nearest functioning infrastructure is on the other side of a mountain pass that is actively sliding. Dr. Anika Kaur, a senior seismologist with the Geological Survey of Canada, warns that the cascading failure is only beginning. We are monitoring the stress transfer from the April 5th event, she explains, pointing to a screen showing a swarm of red dots along the Agassiz-Harrison fault system. The ground is so heavy with water that it is actually changing the local stress field. We are seeing induced seismicity from the sheer weight of the floodwaters. The crust is struggling to compensate. Her team is tracking a 12-centimeter vertical offset near Hope, a signal that the very foundation of the province is shifting under the strain. There is a cruel irony in the Fraser Valley. Communities are surrounded by water they cannot use. The floodwaters are a toxic cocktail of agricultural runoff, septic overflow, and industrial chemicals. Hundreds of freshwater wells and irrigation canals have been contaminated or physically crushed by the shifting earth. Too much water and no water at the same time, says Dr. Tajinder Singh, a public health officer coordinating the response in Chilliwack. We have children showing signs of waterborne illnesses in the middle of a flood zone because the treatment plants are submerged. The ecological toll is equally catastrophic. The 18,000 acres of agricultural land lost are not just a blow to the 2026 harvest. The topsoil, built up over millennia, is being washed into the Salish Sea. Salmon spawning beds in the Thompson and Fraser rivers have been buried under meters of sediment, potentially erasing entire year classes of Pacific salmon. The physics of the Bear Mountain mentioned earlier has created a new permanent state of vulnerability. As the rain continues to fall tonight, the primary concern is the 7,600 damaged homes. These structures are currently undergoing a process called internal erosion. Water is being pulled up through the foundations by capillary action, weakening the structural integrity of the wood and drywall. They are hollowed out from the inside, waiting for the next tremor or the next heavy gust of wind to trigger a final collapse. The 2026 disaster is not a single event. It is a slow-motion demolition of a province. The monsoon-like rains of the Pacific Northwest are projected to persist through late May, and the questions that remain unanswered are the ones that keep emergency planners at Public Safety Canada awake at night. The most immediate threat is the Fraser River. As it surges toward the Salish Sea, it is currently carrying the combined volume of a record snowmelt and 3 weeks of relentless atmospheric river discharge. The question is no longer if the dikes will be tested, but if the geological plumbing of the lower mainland can survive the pressure. Will the Fraser breach at Delta or Richmond and turn this provincial disaster into a national economic terminal point? If the dikes fail, the resulting inundation will not just flood basements. It will submerge the critical infrastructure of the Port of Vancouver, effectively cutting the Canadian economy off from the Pacific Rim for years, not months. The vulnerability of the 7,672 damaged homes is the next ticking clock. In the engineering world, these are known as compromised envelopes. Their foundations have been vibrated by the April 5th magnitude 5.8 quake, and their structural timbers are heavy with absorbed moisture, increasing the dead load of the buildings beyond their design specifications. As the ground remains in a state of near-permanent saturation, the risk of foundation settling and total structural failure increases with every millimeter of rain. There is no timeline for when these residents can return, and for many, there will be nothing to return to. The land itself is moving. In the interior, the active layer of the soil is sliding over the bedrock at a rate of centimeters per day, a slow-motion migration of the landscape that renders standard rebuilding efforts impossible. What happens to the 17 million Canadians in the West and the prairies who rely on the just-in-time delivery of goods through these mountain corridors? The fields of the Sumas Prairie, which should be vibrant with the first growth of the season, are currently under 3 feet of toxic stanchion mud. This is not just a loss of property, it is the erasure of a regional food system. The irrigation canals that form the nervous system of the Okanagan and the Fraser Valley are buried under debris or contaminated by seismic fractures in the sewer lines. The wells are poisoned. The highways are gone. We are witnessing the physical dismantling of the infrastructure that allows a modern G7 nation to function in a high-relief environment. Geologically, the 2026 sequence may be a precursor event. Seismologists at the Geological Survey of Canada are intensely analyzing the stress transfer from the April 5th crustal quake toward the Cascadia subduction zone. There is a documented phenomenon where heavy hydrologic loading, the weight of massive floodwaters, and shallow seismic activity can unclamp deeper faults. We are watching a coupled system where the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, and the lithosphere are acting in a synchronized attack on the built environment. The Hindu Kush seismic zone may be thousands of kilometers away, but the same physics of saturated seismic coupling is now the primary threat to the Canadian West. The forecast for the coming decade is one of intensified cycles. The forests that once acted as the province's biological sponges are not coming back fast enough to mitigate the next season's runoff. The mountains have been stripped, the soil has been destabilized, and the river systems have been pushed beyond their hydraulic capacity. We are entering an era where the 1 in 500-year event is a recurring seasonal baseline. Somewhere in the coast mountains tonight, the snow is melting faster than the river channels can carry it. The hydrographs are spiking again. The GNSS sensors are showing a continuous, ominous tilt in the valley floor. This is the new reality of the Canadian landscape. It is a world where the roofs that held through 40 years of Pacific storms are caving in under the sheer weight of a changing atmosphere. It is a world where the ground beneath our feet can no longer be trusted to remain solid. The data from Natural Resources Canada is clear. The variables have changed, and the margin for error has disappeared. We cannot negotiate with the physics of a saturated mountainside or the stress mechanics of a tectonic plate. We can only watch the sensors, track the plumes, and prepare for the next surge. In the end, the story of 2026 is not one of weather or of bad luck. It is a story of a landscape reclaiming its power, and a civilization realizing that its most permanent structures are, in the face of tectonic fury, merely temporary. Follow the data. The Earth is still moving.